everybody. I'm Tim Smeating, the director of the Poverty Institute. I know most of you, though not all of you. And I want to welcome you to the 14th Robert J. Lampman Memorial Lecture, which is being given by Dave Card. I want to recognize the Lampman family and close friends here in the front, old professors like Jeff Williamson, and the lecturer Dave. Everyone else is sitting back there. Anyway, colleagues, friends, and so on. I usually start, and I'm going to do it again, with a little bit about Bob. This is Bob reading the AER in 1959 in the Sun. He was very special to me and a large number of other people. I was a student of him. He was a great teacher. He would start out by asking a sentence or two, and what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And pretty soon the hour was gone, just gone. And he made you think on your feet. You didn't have to swallow stuff in and spit it back out. And you didn't realize, I think, right away how much you learned, but you did. He was a mentor, a colleague, and co-author of mine. He was a public figure and a trailblazer for quantitative economic research. My favorite story is in 1960, in the economic report of the president, he started putting a table in the back, the fraction of families with income less than $3,000. 3 years later, Molly Arshansky said, well, I came out with just about the same number as Bob Lampman, but I adjusted for family size. And that is where the poverty line came from. Many of us find him as an inspiration, and I found a nice example that I'll show you in just a minute in the On Wisconsin letter this year. But good friends like our incoming chancellor, Becky Blank, Sheldon Danziger, who's now heading off to run the Russell Sage Foundation, look at him as an absolute inspiration. So this is right from something called On Wisconsin magazine. And this is a story of Andy Zimbalist, a very famous sports economist. If you look at the economics of sports at all, you know the name's Roger Knoll, and the second name you know, if you're in my age group anyway, is Andy Zimbalist. And Andy came here as a history major, and here's what he said. While on campus, I briefly became a history major before being captivated by a lecture given by Robert Lampman, an economics professor. He was a lovely man who became a role model for me. Changed his major, became president of the Economic Students Association, and did on. This is just one recent example you just came across of the way that Bob inspired all of us. So I'm very happy to have Dave Card here today to give his lecture on good jobs. Dave's Canadian, from Guelph, Ontario. Guelph is just north of Lake Erie. I used to play hockey about 100 miles from there. He went to Queen's and Kingston in Ontario, and then to Princeton. Here we are 30 years later. He's a professor at Berkeley. His research interests you can see there. He's written widely on all of these. Many of you know his work on the minimum wages. My very favorite of his was an edited volume he did with Dick Freeman called Small Differences That Matter, and how small things in the Canadian labor market turned out to produce much better performance, at least from my perspective. It should be updated. There is more about the way the Canadians subsidize colleges, the way that their schools work better than ours, and so forth, that we really should look at. As my colleague Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, Tim, compare it with Canada. They don't believe Sweden. Canada, they can all understand. So we did a lot of that. He was a co-editor of Econometrica in the AER. He's a fellow and first medalist of the Econometric Society. He got the IZA Labor Award, member of the American Academy for the Advancements of Science, and in 1995, the winner of the John Biggs Clark Award, which all of you know is the award given to the most promising economist under the age of 40. And as far as I know, he's more than earned what they expected from him. And Chris Tabor would kill me if I didn't say this. He was a past president of the Society of Labor Economics.
Like that, finally.
The final one?
Finally, 1995.
Oh. Thank you, John. John's ready for you, Dave. It's going to be an interesting seminar. Among other lectures, he's recently given the Richard T. Ely Lecture. I told him where the Ely House was up the street here. The Alfred Marshall Lecture, the Fisher-Schultz Lecture, the Sargon Lecture, the Woodward Lecture, the Snyder Lecture. Last year when we tried to get him, he was doing the Watinsky Lecture, and we had to settle for Heckman. You got to do what you got to do. the Kenneth Arrow Lecture, and now I'm very proud to introduce him to do, and welcome to Madison to do the Lampman Lecture.
How am I going to... Okay. Well, it's a great honor to be asked to give the Lampman Lecture, and I want to second Tim's remarks about Professor Lampman. I didn't ever have the chance to meet him personally, but of course many of my teachers and colleagues, including Becky Blank, who I wrote a number of papers with and entered as an assistant professor at Princeton the same year as me, were strongly influenced by him, and I hope that I can live up to some of the ideals of kind of doing something useful in economics, which I know we're not always renowned for doing. Okay, and I want to start off by sort of acknowledging at the beginning that most of the perspectives and research that's done on issues of poverty, relative income, lower income, is really focused on people, choices of people, things like production of human capital, responses to income taxes, and of course Robert Lampman was well known for advocating and probably playing a pretty key role in getting the first negative income tax experiments rolling. Marriage and the family. So those are the kind of things that actually I've spent much of my career working on. But if you ask a typical person, and for me a typical person are my three brothers. I have three brothers and a sister, and we kind of span the education distribution completely. So unlike many professors you're going to meet, I think I have first-hand information about all aspects of the labor market, at least in rural Ontario. And if you ask a typical person what it is that's going to make them successful, I think most of them would say, well, what I would really like to do is get a good job. And there's an element of that idea. Actually, if you look back at the economic report, the famous economic report of the president in 1960, kind of at the back of the underlying a lot of the text is this idea that somehow we could take disadvantaged workers and translate them into workers who were more productive in somewhat different environment. And if you think about the recent recession, on the way up here last night, I had a drive from O'Hare with a gentleman who had been working at Cummins Engine, and the company had a major layoff as part of the recession, lost about 2/3 of its production, and this guy went from a white-collar guy running the purchasing department to driving a limo. And that's a very common story, especially for older workers with intermediate and lower levels of education in the U.S. labor market, and actually labor markets around the world. If you study that same phenomenon in Germany or Austria or UK, Canada, you'll see the same story. There's a lot of what seems to happen in a recession has to do with, especially for older workers, loss of a job at a relatively good quote-unquote firm, and inability to sort of reconstruct that, especially for people in their mid-later career. And sometimes I think that one reason why economists have not paid quite enough attention to this, research economists, is because we're the one group that this is not going to happen to, because we all have tenure by the time we're old enough. And I think our understanding of the risks and our appreciation of the risks the typical person faces in the labor market is maybe not quite strong enough. I don't think we really understand the absolute terror that someone who's 55 or 50 years old feels when the economy starts to turn bad and there's a feeling in their company that there's going to be a major downsizing, because I think a lot of those people know that there's that substantial risk of a major problem. So what I'm going to try and do in this lecture, this is not a lecture on a kind of a report on accumulated many years of research on it. It's more a report on some things I've been working on lately that I think are pointing toward a theme, and I've been trying to get other economists interested in it, and been trying to think a little bit about how this fits into our understanding of the labor market. I'm going to argue first that getting a good job is mainly about getting a job at a quote-unquote good firm. So what I'm going to argue is that there really are, of course, individually good jobs, but a large fraction of what it means to a typical person in the labor market to get a good job is to get a job at an establishment, at a firm, where other people would perceive it to be a good job. There are firms, in particular, there are firms that appear to offer kind of systematically better jobs, benefits, working conditions than other firms. And I'm going to argue later on that I think that there's sometimes uncertainty about where those jobs are, but oftentimes in a lot of labor markets, it's pretty clear workers kind of know they would like to get to those firms. Often they know exactly what those firms are. They just can't somehow get there. I'm going to argue that the variation across firms in these premiums is big, and in particular, it's too big to be explored by a very simple idea that economists have, that a more profitable firm sometimes will, for a variety of different reasons, be led to share some of its profit with its workers. So a firm that's extremely profitable, in some sense, can't help but, for a variety of different reasons, give a little bit more to its workers. And I'm going to argue that that's not the whole story here. In fact, I think, it's much more likely that individuals who work at establishments where we would, if we weren't trained economists, but were other people, would think would be a good job or a good firm, are indeed more productive. The same person can be taken from one setting to another setting, made more productive, and earn more and make the firm more money. So that's going to be the perspective I had. And I'm going to then argue at the end of the lecture that the existence of these wage premiums is really important in understanding a lot of different dimensions of the labor market. And I think it's underappreciated in the literature so far. For example, I will be talking about career growth. I'll be talking about displaced workers, gender differences across immigrants and natives, and so on. I think a lot of those differentials are very much related to this. Okay, so this is going to be the outline. And I wasn't exactly sure when I sort of thought about how to write this lecture, exactly how technical to get and how much detail to put into here. I knew that John Kennan would be here, or I thought he would be here, and so I can't get away with just totally BSing my way through it. So I had to, I'm going to have a sort of a mixture of an informal presentation with some, what I think of as actual facts, which is sometimes a bit undigested, and can sometimes be a bit hard, but I'll try and give a background to my thinking on this, what economics and social sciences more generally have thought about the issue of jobs, good jobs in the past. Then I'll present some empirical evidence on trying to verify that it's actually very important to work for good firms. I'll talk a little bit about interpretation, and then I'll focus to the last part about the features of the labor market that can be explained, or at least partially explained, by this idea that there's different types of firms, and some of those firms are better than others, and some workers get access to some of those jobs, and other workers do not. So I'll be talking about cyclical wage variation, career progression, gender gaps, and so on. And I wish I could talk more about things like race differences, or the extraordinary growth of the earnings of extremely high-income people in the United States over the last, say, 15, 20 years. And I personally think that this kind of phenomenon might be inherently there. So if you're thinking about who are the top 1% or the top 1/100th of 1% who have captured a very large share of the gains in economic growth, I think you'd find that a very large fraction of them work at a very small number of firms. And I used to teach at Princeton, so many of them were my former students. Anyway, by way of background, and this is sort of an important thing to get on the table for an economic type audience, it's important to sort of just reiterate or just think back through. In the standard economic models that economists use for most problems to think about, we're well known for having a modeling framework for thinking about different problems and be different from other social sciences. Often, although we disagree amongst ourselves, if you compare economists to other social scientists, you'll see that economists pretty much have in mind a class of, for different problems, different kind of what I would call working models. And the standard working model for the labor market, there aren't firms. There are no firms. There are industries, but it really doesn't matter which firm you work for because all firms are the same. Okay, and a good example of this would be if we're trying to think about corn farmers in Iowa, okay? And so you're driving down whichever freeway it is, I-80, and you can see on each side the old farms that used to be dairy farms or whatever with the barns, and then just fields and fields and fields of corn. And that's kind of the model. They're different farms, but essentially it's the corn sector of Iowa. So it doesn't really matter whether one guy has 1,000 acres and another guy has 2,500 acres, or whether it's all one farm of 3,500 acres. That's the model. That's the standard way we think about it. So in economics jargon, it means that workers are willing to go between firms at exactly one wage. There's a wage for driving a tractor in the spring to plant corn or whatever, and it's the same at all these firms, and so it doesn't really matter which of those farmers you work for. And this is the model that we use to attack many problems, for example, understanding of trade, why trade is good for the economy, may hurt some workers if we open up trade, but on balance is a good thing. Basically the same story about immigration. They're virtually the same story about what's called skill-biased technical change. So the idea that if there's an improvement in productivity, new knowledge about how to do things, that will filter into the labor market, benefit some groups versus others. But in the models that we use to study that, individual firms are not important. They're not really a thing. Human capital, minimum wages, occupational choice, local labor markets. These are all topics that are extremely important in understanding poverty, low income, and so on. No firms. Now, there's a branch of a set of developments in sort of other parts of economics, not labor economics so much, which has really tried to get away from that a little bit. And it's introduced the idea that firms are different. And actually, this originates out of the study of agriculture. So if you look at different farmers, you'll see that some are doing things a little differently than others. A modern, well-trained, high-tech farmer in Iowa might use futures markets to sell his products, might put a different combination of fertilizer and pesticides on his plants, might hire his a slightly different kind of workers. But in this class of models, so there's a lot of heterogeneity across firms, and that's pretty important, for instance, in understanding when you do open up trade, say drop a tariff barrier, some firms are going to take advantage of it, others aren't. But the workers are not going to matter or care about that, because in this paradigm, it's still the case that there's no special link between you and your employer. In other words, just because you work for one employer and that employer is doing well or doing badly has nothing to do with the amount of income you would get. And if you put it that way to a sort of person on the street, they think, oh yeah, this is just another example of how crazy economists really are. Because I think almost no one would really think that there's no special link between themselves and their employer. And then this abstract class of models that I've been laying out, that's the standard working model, that's the case. Another way to put it, and this is even in a way a nicer way to think about the paradox here, in this class of models, one good firm, one Google, living in Silicon Valley area, I can't, Google is like it's this giant presence hanging over us, a big G in the sky. One good firm in this paradigm benefits all the workers. So it didn't matter if you were the number 50 employee at Google or not, because in this paradigm, everybody gets a piece of the action. Whether you got hired at Google or not, Google comes in and bids up the prices for everybody. So that's the way the stock market works. If somebody goes into and wants to buy more shares of Google, they're going to bid up the price for Google, and everybody that has a share of Google, they're going to benefit. And that's the same model that is the kind of standing model for the labor market. Okay. So what do we know about firms, and why do I think that actually there's a long tradition of thinking about firms, and what have we learned about that in the past? I'm going to give a kind of an overview of 30 years of literature, some of which I worked on in earlier iterations of my life, and others of which I saw colleagues and students and so on working on. One line of work that I actually spent a lot of time on was in studying unionized firms' behavior over time, and in that literature was really driven by the availability of information on the union contracts that individual firms were signing. So we could assemble a data set I remember there was a firm there were a lot of firms in Milwaukee. Square D, was that a firm in Milwaukee? There was a lot of firms in Milwaukee that had union contracts that we could follow over time, and we could see how many workers they had and the wages that they were offering, and sometimes you could even link in a bit of information on profitability. That literature found a couple of important facts. First of all, it found that even though you were working for a well-established firm like General Motors or Ford or something like that, your wages would still go up and down with the business cycle. So the wages of workers are connected to the outside labor market to some extent. There isn't complete insulation of the workers at a large firm from the labor market. In fact, the degree of connection is surprisingly large in some sense. Another thing that came out of that literature is that the patterns across different firms were quite stable. So I spent a lot of time analyzing this kind of data, and I came to sort of understand that in, say, the auto sector, there were kind of lead agreements at the big three auto companies. Then there were sort of following agreements at the agricultural equipment companies. There were similar agreements at the auto supply companies, the companies that built auto frames or seat components or brake components, spark plugs, and so on. And those wages would not be the same, but they would the differences between them would tend to be stable. So GM and Ford and Chrysler would have fairly high wages. GM would typically be a little bit better if you actually looked at it. Then the John Deere and International Harvester would be a bit below that, and then the auto company, the companies that supplied the parts would be a bit below that, and those patterns would be stable. And everybody who worked at those firms knew that. So if you could, and you were working at one of the lower paid firms, you would like to get a job at GM, and you knew where it was, but you didn't. Most of the time that couldn't happen. Another thing that comes out of that literature is that wages adjust slowly. And in the era of inflation, which is now getting to be like such a long time ago that it's almost embarrassing to say that you remember it. But in the era of inflation, there were periods, there are a couple of years in the US and more years than that in Canada, where over the course of a year, prices went up by 10 or 12%. And that means that over that course of that year, somebody at the start of the year had a certain wage. By the end of the year, if they hadn't had an adjustment, their wage would be 10% lower. And that's a huge change. And they were still sitting there. They were still going into work. They were doing all the stuff they were doing. And at the beginning of the year, they were earning 10% more than they were at the end. So there was some kind of an arrangement where if you did that, you would be rewarded in the future. So there was stickiness. People knew that if they stuck around, they would get what they called a catch-up adjustment. And so that was pretty common. Now, the problem with this work was there were no workers. In this whole literature, we could study job categories, but we couldn't study individual workers. And there was always a concern that the reason why the workers at some firms were paid more than others was not because that was just the order of things, but rather they were slightly better workers. And so that probably a very real concern. Later on in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a whole new burst of research with the data sets that were, a lot of them kind of stimulated by the initial interest in poverty and poverty dynamics coming out of the war on poverty. And out of that effort from the EEOC came the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, and later on the NLSY, and later on other types of data. And those were data sets that allowed you to track individual workers over time. And some of those data sets allowed you to see a worker as they switched from one job to another. And what that research showed was that there's a lot of job mobility, particularly among young workers, that a good chunk of the gains that young workers earn as they go from, say, 25 to 35 is not because they get so much of an increase on the job, but rather they go from a not very good job to a slightly better job. So that kind of mobility was understood. It was also understood that older workers tend to settle into long-lasting jobs. Bob Hall wrote a paper about that. There was another literature which said, well, we're trying to analyze why do income fluctuations occur, and how do they translate down to consumption and to family well-being. And in that analysis, you could see pretty clearly that there's what I call here a job component of variance. So there was some component that two different workers at different firms, their wages would move up and down, and it seemed to be associated with jobs. In that early literature, it wasn't very common to think of the job as a thing that was generic to the firm, but rather to think about a job as something that was unique to the person and the firm. Okay, so and I'm going to be making a fairly big distinction here, and so I want to try and get a kind of a non-technical explanation for this. So you could think about two views. So I teach at Berkeley. I actually gave this lecture with more Greek letters in it a couple days ago at Stanford. And about half of my colleagues have job offers at Stanford right now. So that's kind of the normal state of affairs. And the way it works in our labor market is if you're at Berkeley, this is useful for them because our salaries, I think like yours here, you can just look them up. So the professors at Berkeley, at Stanford are looking there saying, well, this guy's kind of underpaid. Maybe we should make him a job offer. And so the general view would be that there's, I would say, a firm effect. Everybody at Stanford gets about 15% more than they get at Berkeley. So that's what I'm going to call a firm effect. And I'm going to even make a more extreme assumption or assertion that it isn't just true for the professors, which is a small share of the labor force at a college like this. It's also true for the people that are in charge of keeping the grounds. It's true for all the clerical workers. It's true for the lab assistants. It's just generically true that Stanford sort of pays better than Berkeley. And that's what I would call the firm effect. Now, there's another component, which could be if I, as an individual, go to Stanford. Stanford is a much more conservative place than Berkeley. And so I might not be such a good match at Stanford. So my productivity at Berkeley might be higher because I'm widely considered kind of a raving lefty. And at Stanford, it's kind of like relatively conservative. The Hoover Institution is there. All of the people who are no longer in the ex-Bush administration are kind of walking the halls looking kind of glum. And so that would be my idiosyncratic component. I'm going to call that the job match. Okay? And the prevailing view in the labor economics, and I think still a useful perspective, is that the reason why people do better when they move between firms is that they're actually getting a job match. Not necessarily that it's a better firm for everybody, but it's a better firm for themselves. Okay? And I think we can all, even if we're not technically oriented, think about that. In that perspective, a career, what does it mean to have a career? A career is a combination of you're learning stuff that's useful in all jobs, plus you're gradually finding out the particular employer who can value you or use you the best. And if you're a sports fan, you'll kind of think about there's an element of this in sports. So there's a certain kind of, say, baseball hitter or basketball player who would be a little bit of a better fit at a certain team at a certain point in time. That's the match effect. Okay? But most of what's true for baseball players is you're going to earn more if you play for the Yankees than if you play for virtually everybody else. So that's the firm effect. Okay. Now, then along comes the Great Recession of 1982. That was the previously Great Recession, now only a second. And in that recession, there were massive job losses throughout the middle of the country, and in particular in Pennsylvania. And the Jacobson, LeBon, and Sullivan were two of my PhD students when they started working on this. They got access to unemployment insurance records for the state of Pennsylvania, and they documented that workers who lost their jobs during that Great Recession had enormous wage losses, something like 35-40% reduction in earnings, and those reductions persisted for a very long time. So many of those workers never went back to work full-time or actually just went on to disability insurance or disappeared. And the same thing is happening in this current recession. What's been found in subsequent research, looking a little bit more broadly at job displacements, not necessarily ones that occur with massive recessions, but just generally people who are laid off, is that those losses tend to be quite a bit bigger in recessions and expansions. Interestingly enough, the losses are similar in other countries to the U.S., so I've been doing a lot of research in Germany. I'm going to be presenting a lot of stuff about the German labor market, and although you may think, well, the German labor market must be a lot different than ours, in fact, the losses for displaced workers are very similar in Germany than they are in the U.S. And a question that arises in this literature is, why are those so big and so persistent? And are they too big and too persistent to be explained by these pure match effects? And so that's been a big conflict in the economics literature. A third type of research that's been done is to look at accounts for firms. So you can collect up information. The census of manufacturers and other administrative data sets are available in Washington and for other countries where they have information on output, inputs, labor, number of workers hired, wage bill, and you can get a sense of what economists call productivity. So productivity is sort of like the value of all the stuff that the firm sells minus the value of all the stuff that it purchased in order to do that production, minus some kind of payment for the capital to the owners of the firm in some sort of fair sense. And if you construct that estimate of profitability or productivity, you'll see that there's enormous variability. There are productive firms and unproductive firms, even in the same industry. And that's a bit of a puzzle for economists because we have in mind that competitive forces would really drive out the least competitive firms. And on average, we'd be kind of expecting most firms to be fairly similar in terms of their productivity. Why doesn't the big, highly productive firm just kind of take over the industry? And that's been a major cause of, major source of research ideas for a long time. There's an important new strand on this, understanding growth of middle and lower income economies. And so Shea and Klenow, Shea used to be my colleague at Berkeley, Klenow is at Stanford, they have a very important paper which documents that if you're trying to understand the growth of Chinese economy, which is like one of the biggest sustained bursts of economic growth that we've ever seen and is actually relatively well documented with modern type methods, that a lot of that is occurring as the least productive firms are dying off and more productive firms are growing bigger. And so workers are being reallocated toward these more efficient firms. Another strand of related research has shown that we can actually think of this productivity difference as due to some kind of thing which vaguely we would call management. So if you do surveys of firms and say, what do you do with your workers? How do you organize production? Do you do things that they teach in business schools these days? That would be modern management. Those firms that do modern management have more productivity, substantially higher productivity, and higher wages. And there's even a study done by Nick Bloom and a couple of others where they actually take firms in India, textile firms in India, and they randomly take a small number of them and say, okay, you're going to learn about modern management. And the other group are not going to learn about modern management. And they go and interview them later on and say, could I actually take this firm and make them more modern? Could I make them more productive? And they find a little bit of effect. Not enormous, but pretty important and interesting. The problem with this literature, from the labor market point of view, is they don't typically have any information on workers. So we can't really say. It might be that the way that you become a modern manager and become a high productivity firm is you fire all your workers and get some good workers. Okay, and as a labor economist, my first inclination would be that what do you mean by a good manager is somebody who knows how to hire good workers. Now we're going to see, I think, later that that's not the whole story, but I think that's a problem that has confronted this literature. Now, finally, in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of research on frictional labor markets. So. The markets that I talked about at the beginning, these abstract markets like stock markets or markets where firms don't matter, those are markets that you would call frictionless. And in fact, economists have been understanding for a very long time the labor market in particular is plagued with frictions. And so there's two strands of work that have tried to understand the sources of those frictions and model where they come from. One of these strands of research argues that firms are trying to balance. A firm kind of has a choice. It can set a higher wage and suffer lower turnover. It's easier to recruit. Fewer of your workers are stolen by other firms. But if you do that, you're going to have lower profit per worker. So you're going to balance the turnover costs and the wage costs. So that's one class of models. The other class of models has an idea that firms are posting openings. Workers are showing up at random. And when they show up, there's information revealed about whether this is a good match. So this is more in this match perspective. And when that happens, the workers, if it's a good match, the workers get a share of that. It could be a pretty small share. The evidence suggests it's actually a very small share, but that's the other kind of working model. And there's been a lot of extensions of these two classes of models with very elaborate procedures for trying to allow interactions between firms and workers which get away from these very simple paradigms, but end up, I think, getting economists thinking, but not necessarily solving or resolving what we're seeing. Okay, so finally we're going to come to what is sort of the main guts of what I want to talk about, the new strand of analysis and understanding of labor markets, and that's a situation where we have information on workers and all the firms that work at those firms and all the workers that work at those firms. And this is what we call matched worker firm data. And in the U.S., data like this is available if you can get a contract to work at the Social Security Administration because all the employers send in Social Security remittances at the end of the year. And so I know you work for this employer, and last year you got this many dollars of income. And the earliest form of work in this was the earliest paper in this was written by these three gentlemen here, Aboud, Kramars, and Margolis. Aboud is an old friend of mine, really the first colleague I worked with on my very first job in 1982. So an old friend of mine. And they had access to these data in France. It turned out that John was a undergrad at Notre Dame, and he met his wife there. She was a French major, and he made a promise when they got married. You know, one of these things that he I think, regretted for a long time, but then it turned out well. He made a promise that they would spend a year in France. And so in 1993, he got on leave to France and got access to these data and started this whole industry of looking at workers and firms. And this research has shown, and I'm going to be building on this paradigm very extensively, this research has shown that if you decompose the person's wage into a part that that person would get no matter where they worked, and another part that's like the plus or minus that they get at this particular firm, that those two parts are both important. There's a component of the wage variation that is definitely there for a person no matter where they work. There's sort of highly educated, motivated type workers, and you can meet them in 2 seconds. You can say, this person is definitely somebody that's going to go far and they're going to do well no matter who hires them. They'll always have a good time getting a job. Others that are kind of the opposite of that, kind of a difference between one of my brothers and the other. One of the differences. That, on the other hand, it's also the case that taking the same worker, you can see this same worker jump between jobs, and when that worker jumps between a job, his wages or her wages will go up or down 20 or 30 log points, so 20 or 30 percentage points. Enormous variation. Not always, but there's lots of cases like that in the data. So that is this paradigm where we think of the labor market as generating wage offers that depend on both workers and firms. And this paradigm is the paradigm that I'm going to build on. And I have to say, when I present this, because I know that not everybody here is sort of technically interested in economics, that this is a paradigm that some labor economists, including myself, think is extremely useful and interesting, but our colleagues don't like very much. Okay, and that's I'm pretty familiar with being on that side of the fence. That's why I have this big hole in the back of my head. If you work on minimum wages or immigration or topics like that, you're going to get a lot of people who don't like your work. And there's a lot of reasons for not liking this. One important reason, probably the number one reason, is that it's very difficult to come up with a concise economic theory of what this model, what this kind of paradigm represents. And that's always a stumbling block for economists. And I'm just going to stipulate that. I'm going to say that's absolutely true. Theoretical underpinnings are weak. And I'm going to move on. Okay. I'm going to try and convince you that this is nevertheless important to understand. So this is the point where the labor economists often depart from other economists, because labor economists, we differ from other economists. If you're, say, a macroeconomist, and you're proposing something and you don't know whether it's true or not, you really don't have any way to, there's no way to check. In labor economics, what we do is we go and look up what they're doing in sociology. And oftentimes, sociologists are very far ahead of us in terms of having been out there. Anthropologists, sociologists, been collecting detailed information, been writing case histories. And although we pretend that we don't know anything about it, oftentimes it's the source of many of our best ideas. Okay, so in this case, there's a version of that. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a vast literature, and at that time, it was even respectable for economists to do this kind of thing, which was studying what happened in very specific urban labor markets to individual workers at different firms. And so they tried this. This was done by, the study I'm referring to here was done by Al Rees and George Shultz. George Shultz was the Secretary of State and actually is still out at the Hoover Institution. And so these were not raving lefty guys. These were, hardcore neoclassical economists, and they studied urban labor markets in the Chicago area, and they classified a bunch of jobs of interest: forklift operators, machine operators in kind of low-scale manufacturing, clerical workers, and they went across different firms and interviewed them and said, "What are you paying for this kind of work? What are you paying for this kind of work?" And what they found was massive differences. And it was a bit of an embarrassment to them, if you read it took them a long time to write the book, and they kind of documented these differences because they were kind of honest, straightforward people, but they didn't really know what to say about it. They said, well, we think that the labor market is working in a fairly neoclassical way, but we nevertheless stipulate that there are these big differences, and we're not exactly sure what they're from. We know they're not from trade unionism because we've studied that. We know they're not, we think they're not really differences in the quality of workers. So that's part one. Somebody, actually an old friend of mine, Alan Kruger and Bob Hall at Hoover Institution, had the brilliant idea of asking firms how they hire people. This wouldn't normally occur to economists. So what they did was did a survey of people, and they said, tell us about the most recent job you got. When you got that job, let me ask you two questions. When you got that job, was there any haggling over the wage, or did there was just a take it or leave it? The firms say, okay, $14.50 an hour, that's our pay. So that's take it or leave it, question number one. Or was there some kind of bargaining? And of course, in my labor market, it's all about bargaining. If somebody calls you up and says, we're interested in hiring you, that's just the start of a 3.5-year dance. So economists are a little bit on the one side here, but I think a lot of people have seen the other side, certainly when they were starting in their careers in many cases. The second question is also interesting. Did you know at the time of the first interview, by the time the first interview was over, did you know what the pay would be? And if you look at the tabulations from their survey, about a quarter of people, the pay was known at the end of the first interview and there's no haggling. So those are the guys where the firm just says it's, $11.50 an hour, and if you are going to get the job, you're going to get the job. Another 37%, the pay was uncertain, so they didn't know exactly what the pay would be, but there wasn't any bargaining. So it took the employer a bit of time, but the employer made a single offer. And then, so that's about 55-60% of the jobs. And then there's another quarter or more where the pay was uncertain and there was some bargaining. So you can see in this context, it looks like there's some combination of situations where firms have jobs that are posted and workers are trying to get them, and another combination where workers are interviewing and maybe firms are trying to get workers, so they might offer higher wages if they really like somebody. A third piece of evidence, there are actually systematic studies of how firms hire from administrative data sets that come about in the unemployment insurance exchanges. This is a study, Van Ors and Ritter is a study using data from Netherlands. And what they found was that the way firms tend to hire in the Netherlands is they post a vacancy at the unemployment insurance job finding place, and it'll be there for a long time. They'll collect up resumes, sometimes for 6 months, and then they'll have a bout of hiring. And I read that paper a long time ago, and it resonated with me because being from Southern Ontario, which is the kind of the successful Michigan. When I was a kid, I was surrounded and still surrounded by, my parents are still surrounded by auto companies and auto parts companies. There's a Toyota plant, Honda plant, and all these other plants. And the way they hire is once a year, Toyota has a job fair, and 10,000 people show up in the parking lot and fill out forms to try and get the 120 jobs they're offering. And it isn't just the large firms that do that. A lot of the smaller auto parts firms will do these job fairs, and it'll be announced in the local paper, and everybody will go, or people who are interested will go and sign up. A lot of those people have other jobs, just not as good as jobs, and some of them this is their first job. So there's a sense in which, as I said earlier on, I think there's a sense in which a lot of people know that there's good jobs out there, and they know that these are the firms that have them. And if they've got a worse job than that, they're going to try and get one of those jobs. They're going to go to the job fair and sign up, and if they get lucky, they'll get hired. And finally, there's a whole other side of labor economics, which isn't taught in this kind of building, in the business schools, where they teach people how to set compensation. And the way that's done is also similar to a story that doesn't exactly fit with the standard paradigm. And the way that's usually done, especially in large corporations, is you commission a survey. A bunch of firms will get together. Firms are not allowed to share information between each other, although they're always doing that. There's a couple of recent cases, if you probably don't see this out here, but recently Pixar and Disney got litigated because they had a no-rate agreement. They had an agreement with each other that they wouldn't hire each other's workers. And there was a broader agreement than that between Apple and Intuit and Adobe and Microsoft, a couple other firms, very similar, basically no-rate patents. And you can get away with that in a small number of sectors, as probably sports aficionados know. That's legal in baseball. Baseball can have all kinds of pacts. But the rest of the labor market, that's not fair. So the way you do it is you have a survey firm, and it has to be at least 5 firms. So typically a group of 5 firms in a local area will get together. The firm will go to each firm and get information on a bunch of jobs, sort of what they call benchmark jobs. So entry-level clerical worker, basic machine shop worker, some kind of particular job that's specific to the industry of interest. They'll then construct, for the firm as a whole, what they call a pay line, which is a kind of a smooth-fitting line through the set of jobs ranked by the job responsibilities. And there's often a numerical assignment code for the jobs. This is a more responsible job, it gets 100 points. This is a dirty job, it gets an extra 10 points, and so on. And they will then compare each other's wages, and it's very common, I know about this because of these antitrust litigations, it's very common for firms to say, well, we want to be at a certain place relative to our competitors. Sometimes a firm wants to be the highest, but of course not every firm wants to be the highest. Sometimes firms say, well, we want to be very close to the middle, but a little below. And so firms are kind of taking stances in the labor market. Now, we don't really know how generic that is to the labor market. We do know that's pretty important in some sectors, for instance, high tech and particular white-collar sectors. Okay, so with all that background and 45 minutes gone, now I'm going to get to how do we know that firms matter really? And how can we prove that? And I'm going to show you a simple demonstration of this phenomenon. I'm going to take data from Germany. I'm going to rank everybody by the average wage of their coworkers. And then I'm going to get people who change jobs, and I'm going to look at the average wage of the coworkers on their new job. And what I'm going to show, and this is like this is how I can tell that my brothers are on to me, because I explained that I was doing this to my brothers, and they all thought this was the stupidest thing that they ever heard, because everybody in the Card family household knows that if you have a job and you have the chance to get to another job where the other workers are paid more, you should definitely take that. Okay? And that is true with a vengeance. And this is an illustration of that. This is a graph. It's showing wages for 2 years before and 2 years after job changes. So there's a magical line right here. These are wages 2 years before and 1 year before somebody changes, 1 year after and 2 years after they change. And I'm taking groups of workers. The bottom 4 lines are groups of workers who start with the lowest quartile, lowest quarter of coworkers' pay. And the top ones are people who start with the highest quartile of coworker pay. And the bottom line is people who start with the lowest quartile and move to another job, but it's also lowest quartile. And you can see they don't get anything. So they had a kind of a crappy job, they get another crappy job, they stay the same. The other 3 lines above that are people who used to have a crappy job and then move up. And you can see there's a fairly significant wage gain for that. And on the other hand, if you look at the top lines, the guy who starts in a number 4 category, so highest quartile, and goes to another, basically constant wages. But if you have one of those number 4 jobs and get unlucky and end up at a number 1 job, that's the red squares, you're going to take a big cut. And although it's not necessarily clear, given the size of the fonts, about a 30 or 40% wage cut or wage rise. These are massive changes in wages. And so that is sort of the simplest evidence. This is evidence from a paper that I did with Pat Klein, my colleague. This is the simplest way we could come up with of showing in simple way to ourselves that there was something going on, that it really did matter if there was a high-paid firm. And we've done a lot of these kind of analyses, and what we found is this set of points that I'm raising here. First of all, wages are higher if you join a good-paying firm, in the sense that everybody else is paid there better. That the gaps are bigger over time. And what I'm going to show you in a few minutes is the fact that if we're trying to explain widening wage inequality in Germany, these kind of gaps are an important part of the story. So the reason why the gap between highly paid and low-paid workers in Germany has risen is to possibly between a half and 2/3 due to this component of pay, the differences across employers in the wages that people get. There's approximately symmetric losses and gains. So it's just as good for you to go from a low to a high as it's going to cost to go from a high to a low. Okay, and that's, again, a pretty surprising thing. Finally, an important feature of this graph for our purposes was the fact that the people that are going to take a hit, take a look at the red line there, they were just going along minding their own business. Their wages were flat in the 2 years before that terrible thing happened. And this is a finding that people have seen in these studies of displaced workers too, that somebody could be working at a firm, there'd be a bunch of colleagues at the firm, they're all going along together, a massive layoff occurs, and some fraction of these guys get kicked out of the firm, but there's no easy way to tell in advance who that was going to be. It's not like some of these guys had been doing a lot of drinking lately, and so their wage was gradually drifting down, and the firm has a layoff and says, well, it's time to get rid of the guys with the drinking problems. That does not seem to be, on average, what's happening at all. It's like you're just going along, and then trouble happens, okay, as we would say in Ontario. Okay, so what we're going to do, and what I'm going to propose or talk about, is a model where we have a firm component, a worker component. We're going to allow for other parts of wages, but we're going to be really interested in the relative size of these person and firm components. And the story I want to tell is a story about how much does the person component become bigger over time. Okay, when we're thinking about modern economy versus the economy 20 years ago, we realize that the payoff to skills have gone up. And so people who are low-skilled versus people who are high-skilled, although their kind of absolute difference in what they can do may have stayed the same, the labor market is rewarding those skills at a higher rate. So in a very good example that most people are aware of, the so-called return to college, the difference between high school and university-educated people has risen quite a bit. So we could expect that that person component can become more important. The firm premium, we don't exactly know what that is, but what I'm going to show is that's become more important. And then here's something that you may not have thought about, but is actually really interesting. How are the people assigned to jobs? Is it the case that the people who have the highest wages everywhere tend to be the ones that get lucky and get to the firms that pay the extra premium? If that's true, then you've got an inequality magnifying mechanism in the labor market. So that sorting behavior could change over time as well. And we're going to show that, in fact, that's going on in Germany. So that is magnifying the independent contribution of the person in the firm effects. I'm not going to talk too much about, given the time and given the audience, I'm not going to say exactly much about that, other than to say that that particular class of empirical models of the way wages are determined has a lot of things not to like. And these are some of the things not to like. One of the things that not to like is it's kind of assuming that if a firm is going to pay high wages, it's going to pay high wages to all its workers. So Stanford pays the janitors, the clerks, the lab workers, the junior professors, and the senior professors a 10% premium or 15% premium relative to Berkeley across the board. Now, you might think, actually, they only pay that to certain classes of workers. There's a big shortage of lab techs, so the lab techs are going to get the firm premiums. You can check for that, and I'm going to argue that, in fact, that's pretty small. You might be concerned that the firm component isn't the story, that every job is different. Well, you can check that. You can estimate an alternative model where there's just jobs and see, okay, does a job do better, or can I get away with assuming that a job is at a given firm, all the jobs are all kind of similar at a given firm, so I can, instead of having job components, I can have firm components. For estimation purposes, I have to make some assumptions about the way that mobility works, which I'm not going to get into, but the way it works is you can't have people moving in anticipation of stuff that was going to happen at their old job, dynamic things that were going to happen at their old job or could happen at their new job. And the reason why this is, I think, acceptable is that pattern we saw where wages were going along very flat before and then very flat after when people make these transitions. Even dramatic transitions like from a number 4 to a number 1 or from a number 1 to a number 4. They're flat before and after. So that is some evidence. And then, of course, the critical fatal flaw for this procedure in the what's not to like list is it's not a real model. Okay, so this is a statistical model of the labor market. This is not a model that's coming out of any kind of detailed consideration of how different agents with detailed understanding. It's a conjecture that this is how people are behaving, but it's not really motivated by a specific set of carefully worked out models. So that's a major criticism. Anyway, what I want to do is I want to talk about the results of applying this to rise in German wage inequality. Now, what I wish I could do is I wish I could stand here and give these same results for the rise in U.S. wage inequality. And there's a reason why, because we can't get the data for the U.S. Okay, so it's not really possible to do this in the U.S. unless you have very high friends in the Social Security Administration, which I have none of those. So I happen to have some friends in Germany, and so I'm going to be presenting data from West Germany. West Germany is maybe not the most interesting, although I understand in Wisconsin there's a lot of, this is the Germanist state other than North Dakota in the country. So this is a place where somebody should be interested in Germany. I'm going to be looking at full-time men. I'm going to be comparing 4 eras in Germany. 85 to 91 was the era before reunification. Germany was going along coming out of the 1980s, reasonably solid economy, not spectacular. 1990, we have the fall of East Germany. We have reunification, massive migration into Germany. The labor market was doing relatively poorly coming out of the 1990 recession. This reunification was a massive budget deficit. The economy was kind of behaving pretty badly. By 1996-97, Germany was widely declared the sick man of Europe. Now, the good thing about Europe, it always has a sick man. So far, no sick women. But every few decades, there's a new sick man. So in the 90s, there's actually a paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, I didn't make this up, called The Sick Man of Europe. And then something miraculous happens. Starting in about 2002, 2003, Germany basically goes through a massive change somehow and is now like the miracle. Now there's a new paper called The German Economic Miracle. Now, the thing you should really learn about this, never use those titles, okay? Because it's only going to make you look bad 10 years later. My colleague Alan Kruger made a terrible mistake 15 years ago. He had a paper called The U.S. Employment Miracle. And he wrote this paper in 1993 or 94 at just about the day that the U.S. employment miracle came to an end. Anyway, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be fitting this model I talked about, and I'm going to be looking at a measure of inequality, the variance of wages, and I'm going to be decomposing it into various components, and I'm going to be focusing on 3 major components: the variance of the person effect, the firm effect, and their covariance. And those are those 3 parts I talked about already. And I'm going to be trying to see, over this period, what happened to those 3 components. Now, just as an illustration of how terrible things got, or how different things have gotten in Germany, these are graphs. These are common graphs that economists use to measure wage trends. And what these are percentage point deviations from a 100 level in 1996, or 0 if you want, for each of 4 different groups. Full-time men at the 10th percentile, so those are the lowest skilled full-time men. And it's their real wage, so the 10th percentile of full-time men, real wages relative to 1996 has fallen about 20%, okay, in the last 15 or 16 years. Now, that's an amazing reduction in real wages for full-time men. It's a massive change in the German labor market, a massive opening up of inequality in the sense that if we look at the 80th percentile, so people closer to the top, that's the yellow ones, their wages went up about 5%. So no one was doing particularly well in Germany over this period. Real wages, in fact, were slightly declining, but there was a massive difference between people at the top and people at the bottom. And why this graph is interesting to labor economists is because if we did this exact same kind of graph for the United States and made that turning point 1979, it would look almost the same. Between 1979 and 1990 or 92, this exact pattern was true in the United States. The kind of falling out of the bottom for low-skilled male workers, some modest gains for high-skilled, the typical person a little bit worse off. Okay? And that's been a major puzzle. Those kind of trends have continued, although the major episode of this occurred quite a bit earlier in the United States. The patterns are similar. So what we do, this is another measure of inequality in the German labor market. This is standard deviation of wages, log wages. And it's going up you can see between the starting of our analysis in about 1996, it's rising a little bit, and then it just kind of starts shooting up. And we're going to fit our model in 4 different intervals with those 4 colored lines, and we're going to say, how are those different components changing over time? And then we're going to try and do a decomposition, and I'm going to start with the decomposition. This shows how we can understand the rise in inequality in the German labor market. We can see it as a combination of those three factors, plus a tiny bit that is not explained by those factors. The blue part, the total height of the graph is the level of inequality, so it starts relatively low and rises over time, with a particularly big increase after 1996, as you can see. And you can see the blue part is rising kind of steadily. That's the part about the people. So that's like the difference between high-skilled and low-skilled workers is gradually widening in terms of the wages they can command in the labor market. The red part is the variance across firms. So that is, take a given worker and jump, these are all full-time men, jump him from one job to another job. What's the average variability in that change? And that is also widening. It's smaller than the variability across people, which makes sense, but it's widening, and actually it widens a little bit more than the blue. And then the kind of interesting, or most interesting component probably is the orange component. That's their covariance. What's that saying? Saying at the beginning, on average, the highly paid workers, the people who had high skills, were not particularly well sorted to the highly paid firms, but by the end they are. So there's a component of inequality which is emerging newly in the German labor market, which is the increasing tendency for the highest skilled workers to get the good jobs, and everybody else kind of getting kind of crappy jobs. The yellow component is the component of variance that is left over after we put in those worker and firm effects and some standard controls. And you can see that doesn't rise at all. Okay? So what we've been able to do is explain this massive rise in inequality as a combination of these three components: person part, firm part, and a matching part. Now, I want to then talk, what does this really mean? And I want to say that, to tell you the honest truth, we're not entirely sure. We know some stuff, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of an interpretation. What we do know is that firms that pay higher wages last longer. Okay? So it's not the case. We have a couple of colleagues who are always skeptical. There's a standard view among, especially macroeconomists, that the problem in the labor market is wages are too high. Wages are always too high for some economists. And if we could only lower wages, everything would work out. And so they look at this and say, well, those high-wage firms are making a terrible mistake. They're all going to go out of business. And in fact, the opposite is true. Okay, so, and of course, if you know anything about the kind of standard labor market, if you're my brothers, they would probably kick these guys out of the room for saying stuff like that. High-wage firms survive longer. They appear to be more profitable. In fact, there's evidence, not from Germany, but from France, Italy, and Portugal, that high-paying firms are much more profitable. Also, the jobs at those firms last longer. So it looks like workers value those jobs. It's not the case that if you go to work at Mercedes-Benz, which is one of the high-paid firms here, that's a job that pays high, but they work you so hard that you just as soon work for less someplace else where you didn't have to work as hard. So those jobs last longer. So it doesn't look like it's just an offset. If we look over time, it looks like the firms that were initially, two firms that were initially paying, say, a 10% difference between themselves in the 80s, if they're still around in the 90s, are paying like a 12% difference. If they're still around in the 2000s, are paying like a 15 or 16% difference. So there's some widening between continuing firms. But the main source of this rise in inequality among the firms is the emergence of low-wage firms, a whole bunch of new firms that pay crappy wages. And again, although we don't have direct evidence on this, our sense is this is true in the U.S., that there's more and more firms which are basically specializing in hiring fairly low-skilled workers and paying them very low wages. And that set of firms is kind of contributing both to the covariance term and to the variance of the firm effects. Okay. Is this simply rent sharing? So is it the case that the reason why if you go to work for a highly profitable firm you get higher wages because they just feel sorry for you and give you higher wages? Well, it doesn't look like that's true. Studies, including a bunch of studies that I've done recently and others have done, where you try and study events that raise profitability of firms, like opening up of trade or new patents, they show that workers who work at those firms will get a little bit more, but they typically get a few cents on the dollar of profit. So the variation is much too large for that. An alternative is, and this is the part I think that's most promising for anti-poverty kind of thinking, coming back to kind of the theme of the lecture series, is that it looks like this is endogenous. And a good example of what I mean is a famous paper by Edward Lazier at Stanford, which looked at a firm which switched compensation policies. And when they did that, switched from hourly pay to piece rates, what they found was they could get a lot more productivity out of the workers, but their workers also earned a lot more. and some of the workers didn't like it and left. The new workers who came in were much higher productivity. So what happened in this very simple case study was kind of like exactly what seems to have happened in Germany more generally. There were emergence of new kind of pay policies, new kind of firms, which attracted the more highly skilled workers, got a lot more productivity out of them, and paid them substantially more. And on the other hand, there would be the old firms that are kind of doing something like the opposite. And so we think this is a kind of interesting paradigm for what's going on, although we don't have direct evidence on this in Germany. There's a nice study in using data similar to the data we have from Finland, which shows that kind of pattern is potentially important. Okay, so finally, what else if we believe that there are these firm effects and that they've contributed to widening inequality, what else can they explain, and could they possibly be related to things that other people are interested in? You know, I'm interested in wage inequality, but you might be interested in gender gaps, or you might be interested in macroeconomy. Well, I'll start with the macroeconomy. Why do wages change over the business cycle? To what extent are the wage changes for people who change jobs different from people who stay on the same job? It's been known for a long time that if you look in the recession, people who get wages will tend to drift down for two reasons. One, people who are on a given job will get a wage which doesn't keep up with inflation, so their real wage will fall. But then what also seems to happen is a lot of people will have job changes which are lower than they would be in an expansion. So during an expansion, the job changes tend to generate big increases. During an expansion, they tend to generate big decreases. And so what we're going to argue in this analysis, and I'll show you a little bit of evidence in this, is it's all about firms. Let me show you a graph. This is the data this is again from the German example, 2000s. The blue line is the unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate, if you're not familiar with Germany, looks almost backwards. They were doing terrible in 2005 when we were buying houses from each other at some incredibly crazy rate. And then they've been doing really well most recently. So this is the German economic miracle. Okay? They were like the reverse of us. During that period, the green line are the real wage changes for people who are staying on the same job. So during the depths of the recession in 2005, they were basically getting flat wage increases. They're just barely keeping up with inflation. During 2008, or 2007, 2008, which were kind of these good years coming out of the reform era, their real wages were rising by 1.5% or so. So that was, by German standard, this is a kind of a stingy country, that was pretty good. However, if you look at the job changers, that's the red line. If you change jobs in a recession, and of course my brothers would say, yeah, this is well duh. If you change jobs in a recession, typically a typical worker is going to take a 3% wage cut. Even though many of those are still voluntary, but there's a lot of people who are forced to change jobs and typically are going to have to take a wage cut. So there's a 3% wage loss there, and if you change jobs in an expansion, there's about a 3% wage increase. So there's a 6% difference between changing jobs in an expansion and recession. And the dotted line is how much of that is explained by simply knowing the average wage premium that those firms that you switch between pay. And you can see that all of the difference between the green line and the solid red line is the dotted red line, which means the difference between movers and stayers is all about firms. So it looks like if we're trying to understand the business cycle component of wage variation, it's really important to understand who's moving between firms. Here's another part of that story. Where do the jobs come from? And one of the things that is uncovered right away, I've shown here the unemployment rate on the blue line. So that's got these big spikes with the peak at 2005, and now in this scale it looks even more dramatic, and the downturn in 2008. And the red line is the relative share of all the new jobs that are at the bottom of the distribution, that are at these firms that don't pay very high premiums. And you can see, very cyclical. If you're trying to get a job in a recession, the only thing that's going to be available, or a disproportionate share of things that are going to be available, are going to be these crappy jobs. What about early career progression? A lot of research has talked about how young workers get off on a track. I mentioned this earlier. How much of that is due to shifts between firms? Well, here's a graph to show that. I'm comparing two groups of very young workers, and they're so young that this is their, number one is the first year anniversary of being in a full-time job. So that's at the end of their first year in the labor market. And the blue line is the wage change that you get if you stay on the same firm after that first year, and it's 12%. So as people probably know, on your first year, you often get a big raise. Your second year, it's not as good, 5%, then 5%, 4%. Okay, so that's the typical pattern you see. Very early in the careers, people get big wage increases if they can stay on the job, and then they're still very good. 4% is very good by German standards, because these are young workers, and they're gradually moving up. The red line are people who change. The changers get even more, okay, substantially more, and 2/3 of that difference, which is the dotted line at the bottom, 2/3 of the difference is due to the fact that they're changing toward firms that pay everybody higher wages. So 1/3 appears to be kind of the match component, the pure, this is a good job for you. 2/3 is this is a good firm for everybody. What about displaced workers? Displaced workers, the seminal studies I mentioned before, Jacobson, Lund, and Sullivan. A more recent study using data from the U.S. by Davis and Van Wachter looks at people who lose jobs. This is a more generic notion of displacement. 3 or more years of tenure, 50 or more people at the plant 2 years before they lost their job, and there's a shedding of at least 30% of the workforce. So that's like a downsizing. That's exactly the kind of thing that my driver was speaking of last night at Cummings Engine. And if you lose a job like in that kind of scenario in an expansion, 1 year out, your wages are down 10%. 5 years out, they're down 6%. 10 years out, they're down 4%. Earnings, excuse me. And if I look at a recession, the losses, at least initially, are even larger. Okay, so that's why people don't like recessions in particular, but why there's so much concern about job displacement. Here's the data for Germany, showing the same kind of pattern. Exactly the same notion of events. So you lose a job at a firm with 50 or more workers in a downsizing that affects at least 30% of the workforce, and I'm judging everything relative to the year before you lost your job. And the blue line is your daily wage, your real daily wage, and so you're going to take a 10% wage cut, about the same as in the U.S. And the red line is how much of that is explained by the fact that you just lost a job at a pretty good firm for everybody and now have to find a job at something that's not as good. And so 85 or 90% appears to be due to that. What about other components of the labor market? Gender. It's been known for a long time that women work at different jobs than men. If you look at the share of your coworkers that are female, again, this would be like my brothers would kick you out of the room for saying this, but everybody knows that if there's more women on the job, it tends to be a lousier job, both for the men in that job and the women in that job. In fact, there's about a 15% wage premium as you go from all men to all women on the job. And that's true for both genders. So what fraction of that is due to the fact that everybody in a firm gets paid less, or is it just the women who get paid less, or is it just the men? And so Pat Klein, Ana Ruth Cardozo, and I have been looking at data from Portugal, where we have annual censuses of all jobs, and we can look at women and men on jobs, and we can try and figure out why do women get less pay? In Portugal, typical full-time woman gets about 23% lower wages than a male, which is comparable to what we have in the U.S. It's not the case that the women get less out of going to high-wage firms. In fact, if we allow the women to get the same advantage or disadvantage for different firms relative to men, it only lowers it to 22%. Okay, so only 1/23 of it is because for some reason, firms are more likely to pay more to men and less to men in high and low wage firms. It's in fact looks like it's gender neutral in that dimension. What is true, however, is we can cut the gap down to 18, or about 20 to 25% of the gap, is because women are clustered at firms where both men and women get paid less. And it would be really interesting to see if this is true in the U.S. There's some related analyses, not quite as complete as we've been able to do in Portugal, which suggests that that's true. So I'm going to conjecture that at least 20 to 25% of the wage gap between men and women is due to these firms. What other things might be related, and what do I know about? Well, one thing I think it's really interesting to think about is racial wage gaps. People who've studied race differences in outcomes are aware of the differences in the jobs that black and white people tend to hold in different urban labor markets. And there's a long tradition in sociology, the source of a lot of our understanding, that, for example, having referrals, having somebody in your neighborhood or somebody in your family who's got a job at a good firm is the way that a small fraction of minority kids can actually get a good job. So I think that fits in exactly this paradigm, and my suspicion would be, although we can't do it because we don't have the data, that if we could do it, we would see that a good chunk, maybe something like similar to what we're seeing with the gender gap, can be explained in terms of access to better paying jobs. What about returns to education? Surprisingly, that's what's true in Germany. All of the rise in return to education in Germany is due to increasing concentration of highly educated workers at firms that pay higher wages to everybody. Inside of firms, the return to education actually is slightly declining over time in Germany. So the advantages of being in a big firm, or high-paying firm, are increasingly going to these highly educated guys who are the ones who are more concentrated in those firms. Immigrant assimilation, there's a nice study by a grad student from LSE who's shown that about a third of the rise in wages of immigrants when they first come in the labor market is due to the fact that they start off in firms that don't pay very high wages and gradually work their way up to better paying firms. And I've already mentioned the incomes of the top 1%. My conjecture would be that a good chunk of we would get more understanding about the rise in incomes of these top people if we understood exactly what share of them are concentrated in this handful of very highly paid firms. Finally, let me mention two other areas where I think this is very promising. Networks and intergenerational correlation. When people are studying labor markets these days, they're very interested in the network structure, and this kind of data is ideal for studying that. And my feeling would be that we're going to find out, I've done a little bit of evidence on this already, but my feeling is going to be that we're going to find out that it's really useful to have friends at high-paying jobs. Okay? Now again, my brothers would say, well, yeah, that's really insightful. I'm glad you got a PhD for that. So in other words, what I would call network capital. What is network capital? Network capital is how many of your friends have jobs at firms where everybody gets paid well. Why is that good? Because if you need a job and they're at a firm that pays well and they can help you get that job, then maybe you can get some of that action. Okay? And then finally, and this is my favorite because this takes us back to my childhood, intergenerational correlation. There's a new paper by Francis Kramars and Oskar Scans looking at data from Scandinavia, where you have the data not like we have with Germany, but also with names. Now, and it's true they're all Anderson, but you actually know who's who. So in that data set, they've shown that an amazing fraction of, this is amongst the blue-collar workforce, an amazing fraction of young people start out at the firm that their father and mother works at. And so the road to success is partially, why is there a strong intergenerational correlation? Well, it's because if your father has a good job, you're more likely to be able to get a good job. That's a way that you do that. And I have to say that I've been a beneficiary of this in many times. And when I was in college and in high school both, I got jobs because, not because my dad's a farmer, but because some friends of mine had fathers in steel factories that had very high wages. And so that really financed my career. And I think everybody who grew up in the kind of blue-collar neighborhoods where I grew up knew that it was really helpful to have a father working at General Motors or at a high-paid firm. And I'm sure that that's a very strong component of intergenerational correlation in the United States. So I think that overall, to summarize, I think that understanding that there are firms out there that offer higher wages and others that don't, and understanding that that's an important component of the risk that individuals face when a business cycle downturn occurs. It's an important component of the difference between people who grow up in some families and other families. It's an important component of the difference between men and women. It's an important, changing character of that is important for understanding the rise in inequality. I think that's an important new direction that we could take labor market analysis toward. What we don't have yet is a good understanding of exactly why the labor market seems to be working out that way. And I think that this will be something that a lot of economists will be thinking about and working on. And just like the theorists and physicists, theorists in economics are always looking for something to work on. And I'm kind of hopeful that I can convince more of them to get interested in this and try and help understand it. But in the meantime, I think the empirical work is quite interesting and suggestive that as I think a lot of people who are outside of the ordinary academic research enterprise would know, it's really important to get a good job, and that's a well-defined thing, and that seems to be, if anything, more important than ever. So I'll stop there, and I've got time for some questions.
people get into good firms and get better?
I think, there's a lot to be said about the variation among, among the firms that are considered quote unquote bad firms. That we still, so I think as sociological approach, we still find tremendous variation in wages, and then also increasingly important to look at hours. I think that a lot of the employment-driven inequality that we're talking about in terms of the distribution of low and middle wage jobs in the U.S. Is masking a larger story of how hours are allocated by employers. They seek to manage labor costs. So you can have a relatively higher low wage job that is in fact low paying because it is not providing hours to workers or providing very
Right.
That's
Yeah, no, I think because of the nature of the data that I'm using, that we've focused on full-time workers, although we have done an analysis in the German context and the Portuguese context with hours variability. In the German labor market, for men, the hours variability is relatively modest, but for women it's extremely important because there's been a massive increase because of various reforms and that have gone on. There's been a massive increase in female participation in Germany. Germany used to be, as you probably know, much below other countries in terms of female participation. And a good chunk of that gap has been closed in the last 10 years. But a lot of it is coming about from very small, very short-time jobs. So there's a lot of women working really low-wage, low-hours jobs.
how does the mini job
That's what I'm talking about.
okay? Because that was also an economic remedy for recession.
It's partially an economic remedy for recession, but I think it's also a remedy for these there's a big earnings tax in Germany. It's about a 40-some%. And so that's a huge gap between, if you want to hire somebody and they want to work a little bit, that's a lot of money that's kind of between what the worker gets and what the employer pays. And so the mini job, that's removed. The key thing, I think, that's driving the spread of the mini jobs is they've taken away that tax wedge. And but there's other factors as well. Women have childcare problems in Germany of enormous proportion. Yeah. Yes.
Are high-paying firms sort of evenly distributed across the economy, or are they concentrated in certain sectors, manufacturing sectors, that as the distribution of manufacturing jobs, retail jobs, et cetera, changes, is that changing?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question for the tape. So you've asked whether high-paying jobs are concentrated either in industries or I'll expand that to geographically. They are, as you would expect, I think, the high-paying jobs tend to be larger firms, and they tend to be the sectors that you would kind of expect, so durable manufacturing in the German context. But like in the U.S., durable manufacturing, or even manufacturing as a whole, is a relatively small. It's larger there than here, but it's still less than 20% of employees. So it does look like this high-low or variability in pay structure is pretty generic. It's present in, as far as we can tell, every industry. In the German labor market, there isn't much of a rise in wage differences across regions. So even though, for instance, the area around Munich, Bavaria, has been an economic success, and some of the northern states have been much less successful, wage differences between them have not risen very much. And the analysis that we've done suggests that most of the rise, the modest rise that has occurred there, is all about the people, not the firms. So except with the interesting exception of Berlin. And Berlin, if anybody knows anything about Germany, has been a kind of an economic basket case for the last 20 years, coming out of reunification and the dropping of subsidies that large firms got to locate in Berlin, and other policy problems and issues. And there it looks like the problem for the Berlin labor market, which is a small chunk of the labor market in Germany, is due to that. Now in the U.S., my colleague Enrico Moretti has really emphasized a lot the increasing concentration of highly paid jobs. And in his analysis, he's really focusing on jobs for highly educated people. He's not able to sort of, within the highly educated group, divide between people who would earn a lot in some jobs and others who wouldn't. So, but in his analysis, he's emphasized that a good share of the rise in average difference between high educated and low educated workers is where the jobs are located. And more of the jobs for highly educated workers are located on the coastal cities, which are pretty high rent cities and doing pretty well. And so I think there is an element of heterogeneity by firm size, by industry, and to some extent by location. And as far as we know from other countries where this kind of analysis can be done, that's true there as well. We don't know as much about the U.S., but my guess would be the geographic component of the U.S. would be quite interesting and important.
Dave, are you sure that the rewards given at good firms, high wages, aren't just paying people that have personal attributes that deserve those rewards, and you can't measure them? You can get schooling, even schooling quality and all that age and all that stuff. What about the other stuff?
So the way we're doing that, Professor Williamson has asked, I'm going to, for the record, Professor Williamson has asked whether I'm sure that the wages that are paid by high-paying firms aren't a reward for unobserved skills, IQ or something. The way we're doing the analysis is we're not actually looking at skills. We're only looking at wages. And we're taking a worker who's observed in several jobs. And we're taking the average wage you get on this job and the average wage you get on this job. And we say, okay, on average, if a bunch of workers are observed working at one firm and another time a bunch of workers are observed working at another firm, when we see a worker going from number 1 to number 2, do we see that worker's wage going up? For example, I did when I said when you switch between firms with highly paid coworkers. And the reason why I think that it's actually a very permanent characteristic is, as I mentioned, the wages are kind of stable before you make the transition. So you're working at a number 2 type of firm, and then your wages are going along flat, and then maybe an opening is announced, or a friend tells you about a job in a better place, or you finally get your resume accepted at a better firm, and you can make that jump, and your wages then are pretty flat. So it's not like maybe you were really a good worker, but no one noticed it, and it's gradually being revealed as you get older and older, and people say, I can see this person's accomplishments. I look on the LinkedIn or one of the social networking pages, and I can see their accumulation of, resume building kind of activities and infer they're a good worker. In that case, you would think that even before the transition, their wages would have started to rise because the previous employer sees that too and is aware that there's more competition. So unobserved skills, we think would have been, even if they were being revealed slowly over time, would be gradually rewarded by earlier employers, and so we'd see a kind of a transitional pattern of increases before you move to a good firm, or in the case of somebody who's being revealed to be a worse worker than we used to think. I mentioned that the person whose drinking problem is getting a little worse. That person's wages will sort of gradually drift down, and then the firm will say, "Oh, that's enough. We don't hire people of your quality," and they're going to have to go be security guards and earn a lot less. And I think that goes on, but that's not generically what we're seeing in the data. What we're seeing in the data seems to be much more consistent with just fixed
I'm
tips.
really disappointed in the answer because I thought my kind of thinking suggested an explanation for the spectacular rise in inequality in America since the 70s or maybe even the 60s, which is correlated with the immense average decrease in skilling in the U.S. And I think unobserved attributes are more typically going to be associated with high-skilled individuals.
Right. No, we totally agree with that, and that's what we would interpret the rise in the variability in the person effects. And remember that graph I had with the purple? That's rising. So there is an increasing variability across workers, and that would be observed and unobserved skills together. That component. So there is a component of pay, pretty big component of pay, that is, you could think of it as the thing you get no matter where you work. And that's the part that I would think of as associated with, IQ or motivation and that kind of things. Yeah.
Last question is on that. We have a reception outside for everybody, so please join us. And you can line up and talk to David over the time.
If I understand what you said correctly, that in a recession when workers switch from the workers who keep employment before and after, most of their loss in wages from going from a good paying to poorly paying workplace.
Yeah.
If that understanding is correct, does that mean that firms that are poorly paying tend to do better in recessions, or tend to hire more?
Yes. I showed a graph of that, actually. I said the job openings. No, there's a couple of other studies. There's an interesting study by Till van Wachter and Phil Oriopoulos of the Canadian labor market. And they had a lot of information on the universities that people went to and so on. And what they found, exactly what we're finding in Germany, is that for reasons that are a bit mysterious to me, the firms that on average pay higher premiums have fewer relative openings in recessions. And so if you get a job in a recession, you're going to be starting at one of these low-wage firms. And they've gone on then and said that means because people who start at a low-wage firm are going to take a long time to get out of that, often multiple years. That helps explain why it is that if you look at college graduates who graduate in a recession, not only are their wages lower then, but they're actually lower for the first 10 or 12 years of their career, which is often bad news for younger people. I used to make a joke because I got my first job in 1982, which we used to think of as the worst year of all time. But now that's like, that was a relatively mild year compared to the recent recession. So I think, though, that there's a lot to that.